Good morning. My name is Dr. Milensa Shaninde, and today I'm going to talk about what makes a good fellowship application. I just wanted to mention a brief thanks to Dean Phillips, whose slides these are. So the project is obviously really important part of the fellowship application, but really what's important here is that the difference versus a project grant, for an example, is that the fellowship application, there's a consideration in terms of the training and development of yourself, the individual. So with this in mind, to some extent, the research project is used as a vehicle to develop you as a career researcher, so within academia and your healthcare profession. So what makes your question fundable? That's the most fundamental question today. So really, I think the most kind of starting point is just in terms of really getting your message across. And what we mean by getting your message across is that it's important to make sure that you've got the right question, that you're asking the right question. And really, you have to sell this information to the right panel. So as mentioned, it's important to not assume that your panel knows your research area very well, which means that then you really need to understand your remit and really communicate this as well. And you also then need to demonstrate that you are an individual in terms of this is your area of expertise, and also being aware of funding calls. The last point here is in relation to knowing your audience, and really it's about understanding who your panel members are. In that not everybody will understand your subject topic or indeed be your area of expertise. So really it's important to try and communicate to a wider panel, because it will be a combination of lay members, for an example, all the way to subject matter experts. Again here, so just really focusing on in terms of thinking about what is the problem being addressed. So for an example, you could go back to the literature and indeed just making sure that you're up to date with the literature, having a very clear question. That way it will be easier to look for what you need. So really you could think of the information as a funneling approach. So you can start broad, but not too broad. Just don't tell the reader, for an example, how many people die from stroke if your project is about stroke rehab and people who survive. So it's important to really be specific. Also thinking about the impact. So why is this research important? So for an example, in terms of improving the health or well-being of the public or to patients and healthcare services. So again, what is the impact of your research in terms of the scale of the problem? And also in terms of how does the existing literature support this, or how does it support your proposal as well? So it's just important to remember the impact that you're demonstrating and how your project will contribute to the research in terms of, for example, how it adds to the society or the economy or benefits of the individual organizations as well. Again, it's important to provide a clear explanation. So think about your area, your problem scale, and what the consequence is. We've talked about addressing the health problem. So what is the impact on patients as well as the healthcare professionals, and how this research will fit into your evidence gap. You need to clearly identify the healthcare need that your research meets so that it will contribute to, and also outline this in your application in terms of what your study will provide. It's important that you explain. So when we think about the next step, so, what is the next step? Why are you doing this? Why is your study important? So you need to explain why it's needed now. So in terms of time and its relevance, it's important to know that the NIHR will only fund primary research where the proposed research is informed by a review of existing evidence. And actually, what's also really key here is if you do need to undertake some form of systematic review, you could propose this as part of your fellowship, provided that it is well justified and in the time frame that you are proposing. So what we've just looked at here, for example, so when we look at the objective is to develop a question that can be supported by literature, but also the importance of communicating the importance of your question to non-experts. And the usual starting place for this, it's recommended, for an example, is thinking about it in terms of a broad design. So certain questions may lend themselves better to quantitative or qualitative research, and this is something that you need to think about. So the choice here really needs to be dictated by the question and not your own preferences. And also in terms of the feasibility of what it is that you're trying to look at. So this can be worked on in your training. So if you feel, for example, you lack expertise in maybe say qualitative analysis or qualitative methods rather, but you're not sure how to go about it, you can add this to your training. So you're not coming in terms of being completely naive about it. And then once this is determined, then the standard considerations would then be to think about who are you going to relate this to? So who will be your population of interest and how will you sample them? So again, here sample size, for example, is an important aspect to think about. This must be presented and justified. If it is, for example, that you need statistical input, for example, and you're not a statistician, then it's definitely recommended to seek statistical expertise. When we think about the study participants, so again, what's important is every person eligible to take part in research to be offered the same opportunity of taking part, so regardless of these characteristics, and you can find more on the NIHR website in the research inclusion. So this, again, is important because, again, you need to ensure that your research sample is representative of the population that you're targeting. You need to include how you're going to select your individuals and the needs of diverse communities. So what, again, is really key here. So typical underserved groups in research, for example. So how are you going to target these groups? And also in terms of any inequalities in terms of the geography or the healthcare being received. You also need to explain in your application how you plan to recruit participants to ensure that you're being inclusive, and again, justify any exclusions as to why you're not including certain participants in your study. So when we look at in terms of really having a good plan here, so for example, if we start from the top left, so really you need to think about, where you're going to recruit from and how this will take place. Is it, for example, is it online recruitment or, is it face-to-face, for example? And you need to really start identifying the potential participants, really from the point at which you're consenting them to them taking part in the study. Recruitment is a major concern for any study because there's so many practical things that you might need to think about in terms of, for example, the number of individuals that you plan to recruit. Can you recruit them in the time frame? If you're including sites or locations, is it actually feasible to recruit those individuals from those sites, or do you foresee any potential barriers as well? So again, it's just really important to provide evidence for your recruitment strategy as well, if you're able to. Then the process of data collection also really needs to be clear. So who will collect the data and when? So is it repetitive over time, or is it just at significant time points? And again, are you collecting too much or too little data? Are you collecting the data that you really need? That's also really important in terms of it being able to answer your objectives for your study as well. And of course, if you've collected this data, do you have then a very clear plan on how you plan to analyze this data? So again, clearly relating back to the aims and objectives of the study. So, one good way, for an example, is in terms of outlining in your application how you plan to analyze, say, for example, the objective that you're talking about, and just really making clear what the methodology is. And then lastly, again, it's just really important to plan throughout so that then you're very clear in terms of how long it will take to collect this data. But also actually just to add to that, the impact of missing data. So any data that you're not able to collect, do you have a plan to mitigate that? Or do you have a plan in terms of how you're going to handle that in the analysis? So that's important as well. So again, just, putting it all together. So alongside the NIHR guidance notes to help you complete the application, it's always good use to just make use of reporting guidelines as well, just to help with a structure. But again, just to help with kind of important things to add and just really good reporting practice. Here, so things to avoid. So again, is what you plan, is it feasible? Are you trying to do too much in a short time frame? Again, all too often, for an example, as advisors, when we're reviewing applications, we tend to assess whether it's feasible in terms of the questions that you're trying to ask, whether it's feasible in terms of answering these questions in the right in the time frame that you have stipulated. Or for an example, are there too many ideas? Are there any potential problems that are being identified, and where is this possible? Or do you even have a contingency plan if it does not go to plan? So again, it's just things to really think about. So then the next thing really, so obviously we've considered designing a study that's suited to answering the question, but then also just being able to present and justify your design choices and your methodology as well, and just really being clear. Knowledge and mobilization, dissemination. So again, this is also really important. So what do you intend to produce from your research, and how do you plan to go about communicating what you find? So really here again, it's thinking beyond journal articles and conference presentations. Again, is it a case of communicating more to the stakeholders, to patients, for example, healthcare professionals as well. So again, it's really just trying to describe the anticipated impact of your work, and then thinking about patient benefit, or whether there's going to be any changes to clinical practice just based on your research project and your findings. Also, is there a clear route in terms of integrating your research into practice in the future? And again, really just trying to make this clear where it's appropriate. So again, you might want to think about implementation as well. There are some useful resources in terms of what the NIHR means by knowledge mobilization and dissemination and impact as well on their web links if you need more information there. So when we look at project management, so here we're thinking about how we will outline the processes and things that will basically put in place to ensure that the research described is well managed and actually being able to complete it the way we've described it. So it's just something to think about. A note on the project management aspect as well. So, you might want to think, for example, in terms of, like a Gantt chart. So really, again, just being able to present the different activities that you're going to that you're going to undertake during your fellowship project. So here again, you find that you may need to weigh up the cost and benefit. So again, is it value for money? So again, the funders tend to look at this. Are you being competitive? It's also worth knowing what amounts of money have been funded previously for probably similar projects. So again, you can always go look at previously funded projects to see how much they were funded for, to then see whether you're being realistic in terms of what you're trying to ask for. The plain English is important because this is really the starting point that funders will tend to look at, the first thing that they'll read. And this is really a front cover of your application, just one way to think about it. And it will form, it'll be a very good kind of starting point in terms of the judgment of your application, really. So it's just really important to make sure that you have a very clear plain English summary. And you can get support from different resources in terms of whether the plain English is truly plain. And indeed, again, it's also one of the things that we tend to look at as advisors as well. But also, it's also worthwhile, you might want to get input from patient and public involvement as well. So when we think about, putting it together, this is your project. It's important to talk about yourself, the individual, not referring to the researcher, because it will be you that will be really leading on this. And it's ensure that the panel can see the benefit of the project to you. So how is it developing you as an individual in terms of, your career trajectory, for an example? So we've talked about the justifying costs and demonstrating value for money, and also just kind of summarizing everything in a well-structured abstract as well. So finally, really, so these are the kind of assessment criteria that the NIHR will use to make a judgment about your project. And so these are really taken from the guidance notes. There are similar assessment criteria for other, I guess, sorts of like applications, but it's always good to really just look at the guidance notes and just make sure that you have addressed all these criteria in terms of your application as well.